Does it seem like the cell phone loud talkers are getting louder? Is the waiter indifferent? Did he get your order wrong? Or if you're the server, are diners rude to you? Do people at work or on the phone constantly interrupt you when you're speaking? Is personal space shrinking? Are your children texting at the table? Do people in person seem as snarky as they seem on Facebook or Twitter? Or are you just hopelessly old school to expect what we used to call manners? Let's ask Lisa Gachet, founder and CEO of Beverly Hills Manners. She advises major corporations and brands and even Oscar-winning celebrities. And Lisa, I must confess, when we spoke on the phone when I invited you, I did choose my words carefully. How'd I do?
You were amazing. Your speech is eloquent. It's beautiful. I was very impressed.
Well, thank you. I'm dating myself, but my strict upbringing, please and thank you and you're welcome were obligatory. And now sometimes when I tell the waitress thank you, you're welcome has been replaced by no problem. Why would it be a problem?
Exactly. And, you know, really, it's funny how this has sort of been incorporated now into our everyday vernacular. I actually noticed myself saying not at all to someone who thought they were being an imposition, and I wanted to make sure I didn't say no problem myself. I think that most people will actually perceive that expression as being a bit rude. And I think that some people may use it as a little bit of a distancing expression, particularly in the service industry. I think that's when people use it most, and that can agitate sometimes patrons who are the recipients of that service. You know, if we think about the 5 main magic words, you're welcome is, I think, number 3. Wait, please, thank you. Yes, you're welcome. So I really always encourage my clients to use the magic words. You can really never go wrong with saying you're welcome, because in actuality, no problem does sound like you've been put out in some way, and it's a much less gracious response.
You know, as a lad, I was taught to hold the door for a woman to offer a stranger a seat on the subway or wherever. Back in the early 70s, with Bras Aflame and Helen Reddy singing I Am Woman, a lot of that stuff got uncool for a while. Is that sort of thing okay again, or is a gentleman risk seeming condescending?
And again, in these times, it's funny, we almost don't know. But I actually participated in a museum project about opening doors. And when you think about the act of opening a door for someone, it's really what falls into the category of what we call social grace, common courtesy. So if you think of it in that manner, why would everyone look at that as an affront or a sign of weakness? On the flip side, it's really a sign of respect. When you think about having consideration for someone, whether they're infirmed, whether they are carrying packages, whether they be male or female, if you're walking through the door and someone is behind you, wouldn't anybody perceive that to be rude if you just let the door slam in their face? I think so. And I actually know people who take offense. I mean, who've literally stopped holding doors open for people because they haven't said thank you, for example, or they've taken it the wrong way.
In the post-Harvey Weinstein workplace, is decorum back in vogue?
I would say absolutely. I think that if there's ever been a zeitgeist for what I do, that the time is now. Obviously people are paying particular attention to sexual assault, sexual harassment, but what I am trying to do is work with corporations and talk to them more about the bigger picture, which is, how business etiquette and fits into the workplace. And when you talk about business etiquette, you're really talking about business ethics as well. So things, sort of tenets that we discuss when we talk about manners or etiquette are basic, attitude, consideration, obviously respect, things like honesty and integrity. All of these things are coming into play, and they're more necessary now than ever, especially in these times where we are in a no tolerance society, and where we have these things called virtual receipts, where everything is traceable.
Right.
And everyone is being held accountable.
Yeah, the scrutiny is never going to abate. For the last several decades, these manners that our parents drilled into us have been dissed as political correctness. And after all these sex scandals spawned the Me Too movement, could we see a pendulum swing, a political correction?
I think so. But I'd like to make a distinction between what I think is the difference between political correctness and manners. And I do think that we listen as human beings through a particular filter, and that there are some people that have a listening towards being basically being on the defense. They're almost walking around with frayed or exposed nerves, just waiting for someone to say something that may not be intentionally offensive. So I think while we are hyper conscious of being politically correct, people need to also learn the art of letting things roll off the shoulder or rising above the fray, so that not everyone is jumping on a soapbox per se and getting offended left, right, and center, but that they are really, you know, saving these actions for when they're really most meaningful. And I think, honestly, in these times, we also need to just cut one another a bit of a break. Because the political correctness can, or I personally believe it can go a bit far. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are well-mannered or not well-mannered. Those are two distinct things.
Yeah, and to that point, technology has become an influence. In his book, Intelligence for Your Life, Powerful Lessons for Personal Growth, John Tesh urges that unless you have children or you're waiting for news about a liver transplant, it's too tempting to keep checking who is calling each time it rings. And your date might just think it's another man or woman. And he says it's disrespectful to divide your attention between the person in front of you and a beeping little piece of plastic. It also says you're only semi-important to me. Manners at the table are a big deal. What's to blame for the way this conversation has deteriorated? Is it texting? Is it social media? Has Donald Trump made things worse?
So I would say all of the above. That in terms of when I work with my clients, honestly, nothing should be on the table that isn't a item that belongs on the table, something that's useful for dining. So, cell phones need to be in the lap. So when we talk about cell phones, I think the biggest issue is that people do find it offensive. I know I meet with many friends who still slap that phone right in front of me, and they're multitasking. And we do need practice in being present with those we are physically sitting in front of, and working on our face-to-face conversation, which is something that's sorely lacking. These young kids that are growing up today with their face buried in their phone are really missing out on reading things like facial expressions and learning how to listen to a tone of voice when they're texting all the time, which is really the preferred mode of communication. I have 2 teenage daughters who I see do this all the time. And they're losing these interpersonal skills, which are still highly necessary when conducting business or forming solid relationships.
Yeah, nuance does seem to be lost on the digital generation. Now, admittedly, I make my living speaking, so speech is something I'm very conscious of. And it's always pained me to hear young people insert like multiple times mid-sentence. But in the last decade or so, I hear otherwise intelligent, thoughtful people begin sentences, so what's that about?
Exactly. Well, in my book, I talk about this exact subject, and I say that about at the age of 14, it's time to take those verbal training wheels off. And what we find, and I have this conversation with clients, is that a lot of people tend to slip into this area of junk words. And like is probably the biggest offender. And we've used it in our vernacular in a variety of ways, whether to soften the blow, or whether we're just pausing for effect, or whether we're quoting someone. And it's become, especially if you have children, I mean, again, my teenage daughters, unfortunately, despite the fact that I correct them all the time, still use it. And I hear their friends using it. And I think that parents have actually picked up on this. And unconsciously, I've actually found myself using it. And once I noticed my daughter recording me at the time. So it's something that we just have to become more conscious of. And, you know, when we speak about the English language, there are hundreds of thousands of other words we could be using that make us sound so much more intelligent. And so we just have to become more aware and make a choice to eliminate those words.
Here's my pet peeve. You get somebody's voicemail, you follow the instructions, you leave a message. Moments later, your phone rings, and they say, hey, you called. And I say, you get my message? And they said, no, I just saw that you called. That drives me nuts. I got 15 seconds. What is your #1 pet peeve?
Yes, I agree with you there. My number, by the way, again, in my book, I have A to Z glossary of all of my pet peeves, just so you know. However, I think for me, my biggest pet peeve is when someone is sick. And then they go out and socialize. And then I go to shake their hand, and they refuse my handshake.
Let the record show that I ended our conversation by saying thank you, Lisa Gachet, whose very cool website is BeverlyHillsManners.com.